Good morning. So today we are going to be continuing in our series called The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of David. So last week we kind of jumped right into the fire with David. David and Goliath was the headline. We talked about how David had this ridiculous heart of faith. This week we're going to kind of take a step back and talk about why God chose David and how David stayed the course. Proverbs 4:25 through 27. Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Give careful thought to the paths for your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. Do not turn to the right or the left. Keep your foot from evil. Wouldn't it be great if all it took was those great inspirational quotes that so many people love to post on their social media accounts? You know, like some of these. Keep your face always toward the sunshine, and shadows will fall behind you. Walt Whitman. Or maybe success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Winston Churchill. Like I said, wouldn't it be great if all it took was when I'm struggling to stay on the path, all I got to do is post an inspirational quote, and then all of a sudden, I'm right as rain, Jesus is Lord, praise God, and I'm back on track. But that's not the way it is it? If we're honest, yes, we can draw inspiration from quotes and scripture and movies, but life is full of left turns and right turns that cause us to wander away from that straight path. I mean, it sounds like a great plan. You know, all I got to do is just keep my Bible in my pocket, and then all the inspirational quotes that remind me of certain scriptures and problems that I have in my life. I'll just open up my Bible and I'll read it and I'll get right back on the right path. It sounds like the perfect plan, doesn't it? I think Mike Tyson said it the best. Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. That's how I look at this Proverbs 4 passage. By now, we're all aware of the situation that Florida's been dealing with from Hurricane Ian. Now, many of you already know that the place that was hardest hit, Fort Myers, that's my hometown. I grew up playing volleyball on those beaches right down the street from that hotel. That's all over the national news, right? I also have a brother that lives in Cape Coral, which isn't far from there. He was keeping us updated as, the storm continued to go on. He was sending us video updates and whatnot. But I mention that to say this. I'm very well of the perception that many people have of Floridians. The rest of the country thinks that people from Florida are crazy. Now, I'm not going to argue with you on that point, but among other things, one of the biggest reason is that when hurricanes come, Floridians don't run. They get their cameras out and they get ready for some great footage. And they laugh at all the newbies that are too scared to stay. Now, I feel like I could say the same thing about Ohioans. I mean, who in their right mind gets a notification on their phone or sees on the lower third of their TV to go to the basement, or hears a siren start up and goes, I need to get my phone out? I mean, at least we kind of had a plan and some level of preparation. But anyway, my brother in Cape Coral, who's lived in Florida most of his life, so over 50 years, he said this is the worst he's ever seen. He said it looked like a war zone. He sent me this video. It looked like a war zone. Just cars overturned. And what else I've seen is some also who stayed. Those crazy Floridians are now saying, I should have left. They thought they had a plan until Ian came and punched them in the mouth. And here's the question. How do you determine when to stay? Because in life, there's struggles and battles and hills that we try to stay on that just aren't worth it. How do you personally determine when it's time to walk away and when it's time to stay and stand? Be steadfast in your position. As we age, hopefully we can figure this out. We learn to choose our battles. In my younger years, I thought every hill was a battle to die on. I did. Anybody else go through that phase? I would just try to fight on every hill. But eventually, I started to realize that every hill that I fought on it started to take a little piece of me. I realized that you don't have to do that. You're just making your life more difficult. Now, there are times when you do need to stand and when you need to stay and struggle, when you need to figure out how you're going to stay on that narrow path. But all of us have to discern, what is it that is worth fighting for? What is it in life that's worth dying for? And I hope that, again, as we're all in a place in our maturity and our walk, that we would all agree, as we looked at what happened down in Florida, stuff, material possessions are not worth dying for. It's not worth risking your life to keep your house and to keep the army of looters at bay. I can see that now as a husband and a father, but I haven't always looked at it that way. But even with that being said, there are still some times when it is worth risking it all. I want to show you a video of a guy named Johnny. Johnny stays in Naples, which isn't far from Fort Myers Beach, some of the hardest hit areas.
In these times of darkness, we need a little bit of light to smile. I love those stories. I just never thought I would be one.
So Johnny's 84-year-old mom decided that she was going to hunker down in her own house, 4 blocks away until the storm surge came into her house. So she's kind of keeping him updated, but once she told him that the water in her home was now at her waist, he left his kids in his attic along with their pets, and he jumped out into the now chest-high water. He swam for 40 minutes to go and rescue his mom. And what's crazy about this is that as he heads out, he finds a life vest, and then he finds a paddleboard, and he uses these things to get to his mother's house. As he shows up to find his mom inside his house, he decides he's going to take a picture real quick of his mom before he rescues her. I'm sure she's going to, really appreciate that picture's all over the national news now. But he had determined that his mom was worth dying for. But I want to go back to what he said. In these times of darkness, we need a little bit of light to smile. And then he said, I love those stories. I just never thought I would be in one. What a great line. Do you think he just kind of came up with that right on the spot? I don't know, but it's a great line. I think that's kind of where we're going today with David. Again, for the first half of our life, we're trying to learn the difference, when to stay and when to go, what is worth fighting for, what is worth dying for, what is worth risking it all. I think it's pretty safe to say that moms are worth it, right? But did you know, whether you realize it or not, you have your own little list of things that you're not willing to negotiate on? You'll stay the course no matter what. No matter how high that water comes in, it doesn't matter. You will refuse to leave the path as described in Proverbs chapter 4. The Bible is full of these examples that we read and that we love. These stories are so rich with examples of people who stay the course when most would have run away. And of course, David is no exception. I want you to look at Acts 20:24. However, I consider my life worth nothing to me. So this is Paul's hill. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. That was the hill that Paul considered it worth being beaten, arrested, and eventually dying on. My question that I want to ask you, have you found yours? What is the task that God is giving you that you are willing to stay no matter what? That you would rather die than to be removed from that hill? So let's start making our way back to David's story. Let me give you the shortened version of what's going on here leading up to David's story. Acts 13:20-22. All this took about 450 years. After this, God gave them judges until the time of Samuel, the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, And he gave them Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years. After removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. That's the short and sweet version. All right, Israel's in this weird place right now, and if you want to look at it, it's in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel, especially chapter 8. Israel's in this really weird place because they've been living among these pagan nations, and they've observed that all these other pagan nations, they have kings over them, right? And they thought, well, how cool would it be if we had a king? A king who would tell us what to do. And so they said, hey, we want a king. Give us a king. Prophet Samuel's arguing with them, telling them, you don't want a king. If you get a king, he's going to make you go to war. He's going to take the best of what you have, the best sons and the best daughters, and he's going to make them slaves. You don't want to do this. He's going to tax you. You don't want a king. And they said, oh, yes, we do. We want a king. And they continue to argue with Samuel. He says, God is your king. But they wanted what everyone else had. You've heard the saying, be careful what you ask for because you just might, Well, they got it. They got the king they thought they wanted. And it was King Saul, and everything was pretty much going according to plan until it wasn't anymore. And so we move forward here, and in 1 Samuel 13, we find that Saul had done something unforgivable. I mean, Samuel might have forgiven him, but not God. This was the beginning of the end for King Saul. This was what precipitated the battle of David and Goliath. As was the custom, heading into battle, sacrifices had to be made, right? Saul and his army awaited Samuel's arrival to offer this burnt offering to God. But Samuel doesn't show up when he's supposed to. And so King Saul decides he's going to perform the burnt offerings to the Lord. Big no-no. Just as he's finishing up, Samuel shows up. Verse 11 of chapter 13, he says, what have you done? No, Saul. I mean, you got to understand that Samuel and Saul were close. They were good friends. Saul tries to reason with him. He's like, you didn't show up, and the men, they started to leave, and I just kind of panicked, and it must have broken Samuel's heart to have to say this to his friend, but he said, you don't get it. You can't take this back. He says, you have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God that the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom for Israel for all time. Instead, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. We know him as David. Because Saul didn't stay the course, because Saul chose to wander off of the path, this was the beginning of the end, because Saul failed to stay the course. Even though he begged for forgiveness, this, for whatever reason, was a line that he crossed that caused God to say no. I mean, it wasn't the only thing he did. He did even more later on. But this right here is where it all began. And so this is where we're going to pick up with David's story. So David, this young man who's got a total of 7 brothers, so there's 8 in the pack, and David is the youngest. So we're going to pick it up in 1 Samuel chapter 16. But what we're finding here is that David, he's kind of despised by his whole family. Right out of the gate, we see that, there's some animosity in this household. Let me give you an example. When the prophet comes and he invites the entire family to a sacrifice meal, where they're going to make sacrifices and eat together, and it's a special occasion. It's kind of a big deal. And Jesse was supposed to bring all of his kids. That was the instructions he was given. Do you know who they left out? David. David was intentionally excluded. I don't know when Jesse learned that the prophet was looking for the next king of Israel, but he realized that something major was going on here, and they left David out. And it wasn't because they were trying to protect him. It was because they thought so little of him. But at this one point, they realized that this right now is about being the next king. And to be honest, even Samuel was seeing these other 7 brothers, and he was impressed. I mean, they were tall, they were good looking, they were fit, they looked like a king. To which God says to Samuel, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The same words he used for King Saul. I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance. And don't we? God looks at the heart. God sees what nobody else can. And so Samuel goes through and he examines each one of Jesse's sons, and each time he's like, nope, next, not it. And finally he gets to the place where he says to Jesse, he's like, do you not have any other kids? And Jesse goes, yeah, but I mean, it's David. He's out there with the sheep. God doesn't want David, trust me. And this is crazy here. You got to understand that they're all sitting there and they're all eating food. The party's already pretty much started. And so this prophet stands up. And then he makes everyone else stand up because that's the respectful thing to do. And so they're all standing and he says, we will not sit down until he gets here. So can you imagine David, who they don't think anything of, and they go out and they get him and they bring him in. He's been with the sheep, probably doesn't smell very good. He's probably hot and sweaty, and he has no idea what he's about to walk into. He walks into the room, and everyone, for the first time, is standing waiting for him. Can you imagine how he must have felt at that moment? The conflict that's going on inside of him. His own family, who had neglected and forgotten him, are now honoring him. Adversity. What I want you to see is that David's story begins with adversity. He doesn't just jump from the frying pan into paradise. He wasn't leaving a place of privilege to go to another place of privilege. He was leaving hardship to go to even more difficulty. I want you to understand that right out of the gate, because it kind of shatters some of our paradigms that as we think about what it means to be blessed and to be used and to be chosen by God. We think it means that we have everything we want and that everything is perfect, which is why most of us are so frustrated and discouraged and disappointed. Because we've adopted this worldly mentality of what it looks like to be blessed and used by God, when in fact, what we find, whether you look at David, whether you look at Joseph, whether you look at Noah, Moses, Jesus, every single person, God uses adversity as part of their story. Search it out and see if it isn't true. It was his heart. The one thing that David had that none of his brothers had. The one thing that David had that King Saul didn't have. It was a heart that chased God. It was a heart that chased good. I can't think of a better qualifying characteristic of what we should all be looking for in our leaders, whether it's in the church or in our country, is a man after God's own heart. Looking back, what we find here is that David didn't see this coming. No one saw it coming. Not even the prophet saw this coming. David wasn't the natural choice. I mean, his family didn't see it. Israel didn't see it. David didn't see it. David didn't think he was being prepared for being a king. He thought he was just going to be a shepherd for the rest of his life, just kind of carrying on the family business, but not a king. But he's starting to realize here that my life is about to change. And in verse 13, it says, from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And as it does, it leaves King Saul. And Saul knows it. This is where everything changes for David. In this account that we have, we see that David has some unbelievable successes in the future. We know the story, but if you know the story, you also know that he has some incredible failures too. You might be saying, well, wait a second, Dave, I thought we were talking about staying the course, staying on the path. Did David deviate from the path? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he did. There were times where he really blew it. You're going to find that David suffered for those events. And I'm so glad that the Bible doesn't censor this, because what we see in this story, this account, we see that David was a flawed man. God uses imperfect people. The only perfect person God ever used was who? Jesus, yeah. God uses people like you and me. And David was no exception to that. And just like us, we find that David struggled with his faith. David struggled with his family, with his health, with failure, temptation, and incredible loss. Where he was mad at God, he struggled with homelessness and obedience. Just about every relationship that you can imagine, from friendships to mentors, and being trapped. All while being dead smack center in the center of God's will. And again, some people say that the safest place to be is at the center of God's will. I would say that's kind of like being in the eye of Ian. I mean, sure, you're safe because you know God's going to use you, but you're watching all these amazing things happen all around you that are equally as exciting as they are terrifying. Again, we get to see this, and it'll continue to unfold in the stories that we're going to go through as we unpack the life of David. Here's the reality, again, back to those inspirational quotes. Life is hard because we all have these cycles, these seasons that and again, the beauty of this is we get to see this lived out in the life of David, making a human, emotional connection with him. Because like us, David had some pretty good days and he had some pretty bad days. Moments where he's so strong and courageous, right? And then there were times where he was so weak and a coward. Times where he feels like he can't lose, and then times where he feels like he just can't win. We've all been there. Life serves us these daily doses of discouragement and disappointments and defeat. And what we learn from the life of David and his story is that sometimes, and this is the one part you should write down. If you don't write anything else down, write this down. Sometimes all we have to do, all God is asking us to do in our hardest moments, do you know what it is? It's just stay the course. Just stay the course. That's all you got to do. Stay on that mountain. Stay on that hilltop. Don't budge. Don't deviate. Not to the left, not to the right. Our challenge in life isn't finding the right path. If you're here, you've already found it. You know what the path is. The hard part that we all bump into on a regular basis is staying on it. That's where we struggle. And aren't you so glad that we have each other to encourage one another along the way, to stay on the path, and they're there to grab you and pull you back if you begin to wander. Galatians 6:9, the Apostle Paul, the same guy who knows what hill he will die on, he says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Don't quit. Find the hills that are worth dying on. Plant your feet and be unmoved. And again, it sounds like a good plan until you get punched in the mouth. There's a movie clip that I want to show you guys. We've all got these icons, these people, these movies, and I don't know who it is for you, but it's people who encourage you. We've all got these people in our lives, and whether it's a real person or someone fictitious, that we look to in our moments where we want to shrink back, when we're afraid, and we think of this person. And I don't know who this person is for you. It could be a family member, it could be a church member in here, but there's somebody in your life that when you have those moments of doubt and where you want to quit, when you're disappointed and discouraged, who do you look to? And of course, everyone who goes to church would say Jesus. And of course, I would say Jesus. And I do look at Jesus. But there's a speech in a movie that we just watched Monday night. Have any of you ever seen Braveheart? Okay, so some of you are going to get a really cool speech real quick. Let me show you this.
so they could own more lands. Did I have to work for them?
Nor me. All right, lads, let's go home!
William Wallace?
Can't be. Not tall enough. This is our army. To join it, you give homage.
I give homage to Scotland. And if this is your army, why does it go?
We didn't come here to fight for them.
The English are too many.
Sons of Scotland, I am William Wallace.
William Wallace is 7 feet tall.
Yes, I've heard. Kills men by the hundred. And if he were here, he'd consume the English with fireballs from his eyes and bolts of lightning. I am William Wallace. And I see a whole army of my countrymen. And you may die. Run, and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds, many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
If you haven't seen that movie, you need to watch it. But you know what I want? I want a hype man like William Wallace. I want, anytime I get discouraged and even think about deviating from the path that God has laid out before me, this crazy guy riding a horse with blue face paint on would come in and he would yell at me and he would say, "Be a man of God. This is your hill." I mean, yeah, I'd kind of have a lot to explain, you know. But wouldn't that be cool? Who is your William Wallace? Who is that person for you? Who is the person you look to when you're struggling? When the world has beaten you down and you feel like giving up and you call that person up. It's a person that motivates you and they just speak to us and they remind us, they summon something within us to give us the courage to stay the course. Who is that person for you? You know, it's like the guy who went and rescued his mom. And when he said, "In these times of darkness, we need a little bit of light to smile." And then he says, "I love those stories." We all love those stories. But what he said was, "I never thought I would be in one." What he came to realize is what David one day would realize himself. And maybe one day you'll realize. We are all in someone's story. You are somebody that somebody else looks to when they're down, when they're discouraged, when they need a little William Wallace in their life. That's who you are if you will stay the course. Be that example for them. Johnny was that example for his kids. He is their hero. And the hard part of being a hero is staying the course. Don't become weary of doing good. for at the proper time we will reap a harvest of reward if we don't give up. This path that Proverbs is talking about is not the path that everyone takes. But if you're here today and are considering taking that path, the same path that David walked and many after him, know that you are not alone. The people to your left and to your right will be walking with you.